A Mediterranean Mystery by Fred E. Wynne. Chapter 1, in which I order champagne. I hate the sight of those terracotta envelopes that telegrams come in. They have often announced ill news to me, and even in the absence of ill news, they bear with them an atmosphere of emergency, suggestions of sudden action, which is always detestable to me. Bates stood by while I read the ugly Pugh's form which announced, had I known it, the opening of the curious chapter in my otherwise quiet life which I am now trying to recall and to record in its incredible details. Incredible, I mean, from my then point of view, for a life and circumstances more remote from adventure than mine were then, it would be hard to imagine. "There is no reply," I said to Bates, who stood awaiting instructions. "It's Mr. Edmund coming for a few nights. Tell Mrs. Rattray he will be here for dinner, and see that a room is ready." "Yes, sir. And if he comes without luggage again?" A little pang of a kind of jealousy shot through me. It was 2 years since I and Bates had seen this ne'er-do-well brother of mine, a year since I had even heard from him, and yet the circumstances of his coming without luggage was fresh in this man's mind. There was a lightening of his countenance at the mention of his name, and I knew well that my dinner would be one of unwonted luxury. "He can wear some of my evening things, and give him pyjamas and one of your own razors, Bates. I will not have other people using my razors or my fountain pen." Edmund had always been an anxiety and an expense to me. He was now the only incalculable element left in my ordered life. But Bates seemed to be waiting for something, and it was as though a gleam of Edmund's endearing eyes, the crisp curl above his forehead, the flash of his teeth between merrily curled lips, were faintly reflected from the expectant look in Bates's face. "Oh, and Bates, you can bring up a bottle of the '47 port, and decant it carefully." "Yes, sir. Anything else from the cellar?" "No," I said. "I suppose there's whisky and claret in the dining room." "Very well, sir," said Bates reproachfully as he closed the door. "No?" I thought. "I'm hanged if I'm going to have champagne up. He would only expect it every night, and he hasn't even written for a year. Now of course he's only coming for more money." Then I rang the bell, and Bates returned with suspicious alacrity. "You should better bring up a bottle of the '93 Pommery," I said. It was one of those delightful days in March when there is real daylight in the late afternoon, with a white gleam in the sky and a wind keen enough to make possible the indoor joys of winter. The aspect of my study in my Sussex vicarage was extraordinarily peaceful to me. When I looked over the top of my book, as I often did, I looked into the bright friendly eyes of a fire of mingled coal and drift wood. When I turned my face half round to the left, as I also often did, I looked across the familiar discreet harmonies of my room to a long French window which framed a view of my lawn, whose grass was now smoothing and renewing itself after the winter ruffling, of the red footpath on the border already gilt with crocuses, of stately trees beyond my frontier, their bare branches showing the faint pubescence of early spring. Among these trees were the red tiled roofs of the village, and beyond it the Channel, grey today under the silver sky, and covered with rushing white horses whipped up by the steady east wind. There was one long banner of smoke on the horizon, and a few miles from shore the brown sails of a couple of trawlers going close hauled to windward with the flood tide under them. All this peacefulness and beauty was, I say, particularly grateful to me. It was like a gentle accompaniment to the book which I was reading with no less attention on account of this consciousness of my surroundings. I had attended a clerical meeting in the morning, and had, I suppose, unwisely said what I really thought about some of the topics under discussion. Now I was rereading with especial interest the chapter on persecution in Lecky's Rise and Influence of Rationalism in Europe. Only a few hours before I had seen among my colleagues the faces of the persecutor and the heresy hunter, and I was undoubtedly heretical. It was difficult to reflect that if all this had happened just a short time ago, say in the time of my own great-great-grandfather, these same men would have rejoiced to see my live body roasted, that even now, given the power and the custom, the spirit of Calvin and Torquemada was not dead, that it still lit the eyes of living men who could believe in exclusive salvation. After the fret, the prejudice, and the spluttering of modern theological controversy, there was healing for my soul in the calm intellectual austerity of Lecky. Such were my preoccupations then. The academic interests of a scholarly, well-to-do bachelor parson of 45 with a hobby for homing pigeons. I had just looked at the clock and realized with another glow of satisfaction that my afternoon tea was almost due when my man Bates came in with this disturbing telegram. This Edmund, who was about to burst again into the quiet routine of my life, was my only brother, now practically my only relative, and some 15 years younger than myself. At the time of his first appearance in the world, I was old enough to regard the news of his arrival as an indiscretion on the part of my parents. My father was a younger son of our old and once distinguished Irish family. He was one of those soldiers who are always doing the hard, rough work of the empire and seeing the other men in the comfortable positions getting the honors and rewards. I was born in India and thanks to my mother's moderate fortune had been sent home in childhood to receive an expensive and perfectly respectable education. At the time of Edmund's birth, my father was at home, railing at the Indian government and the War Office, earning, I fear, the reputation of a bore with a grievance in the service clubs, and certainly blasting any prospects of a further career he might have had by his frank and perfectly just criticism of important persons. I was at Wellington, destined for Sandhurst and the army, for in spite of my father's atrocious experiences, it never occurred to either of us that the world held any other career for me. Looking back, I don't think I really had any desire to be a soldier or knew at all what was implied in it. It just seemed inevitable, and I suppose I had up to then as much part in shaping my destinies as most people. I suppose that is how the ranks of the pawnbroking, cheesemongering, grave digging, and other apparently undesirable callings are kept filled. But I knew enough to resent quite definitely the halving of my patrimony with his younger brother, concerning whose intrusion I had been in no way consulted. I bitterly resented also the continued illness of my mother after this event. During the greater part of my short life, which then seemed so long, she had been but a memory of infancy, repainted during one long summer when she had been home, and then her gracious, lovely presence had utterly outshone even the ideal of memory. I had for her a boy's romantic devotion, and her death when the child was a year old, and I almost a man, overwhelmed me with the force of a man's passionate grief upbraiding the exquisitely tender sensorium of a child. And then the baby Edmund began to grow like her. From the first his eyes and mouth were hers. As he learned to speak, he spoke with her voice, and innumerable little gestures reminded me of her. This was my first solace, and my early selfish, boyish resentment died down and warmed into something else, transmuted by grief into the second great attachment of my adolescence. Nothing could quite kill this, and I suppose that is why at 45 I ordered the champagne for him. Edmund was of course intended for the Navy, and as he grew older it seemed as if this were nature's arrangement as well as the family's. There was no mere acquiescence in this case as in mine, but all these family dispositions were shattered just about the time I should have entered Sandhurst. The whole of my mother's property consisted of her interest in certain estates in the Straits settlements, and by some mysterious fluctuation of trade these suddenly became almost valueless. Relying on the stability of this property, my father had invested the whole of his patrimony in an annuity so that the family might live with more dignity during his and her lifetime. With this we still could make ends meet and even overlap while he lived. But at his death there would be only a pittance for Edmund and myself. It would be utterly impossible for either of us to maintain the family tradition in the services. For a youth in my position it was considered that there was only one respectable alternative, the Church. It was agreed by everyone, including myself, that I had not sufficient brains for the bar. We were that simple kind of folk that really believe that a high order of intellect is necessary for success at the bar. I am told that this carefully fostered superstition is not yet quite dead. I was accordingly entered at one of the less expensive colleges at Oxford, where I followed all the fashions, social, mental, and moral, acquired the usual affectations, had my mind rendered as far as possible inaccessible to ideas, and otherwise enjoyed the advantages of what is called a university education. It was the fashion then for superior persons to be patronizingly enthusiastic about what they called the working man. I accordingly obtained a curacy in an extremely unpleasant industrial district, and entered holy orders without so much as suspecting that I had a mind or a character of my own. From the working man I learned a little about the technique of pigeon flying and breeding. This information has been invaluable to me ever since. It has provided me with one of the principal interests in my life, and even a little very precious distinction when one of my birds came home fourth in a great cross-channel event. I also learned that the working man has no use whatever for gentlemanly young curates from Oxford, or their quaint little fistful of prejudices. I had the good sense to get out of his way as soon as I could and begin my education. In the meantime Edmund had developed on rather startling lines. Two preparatory schools had refused to keep him for a single term, the first on the grounds that he had corrupted the entire establishment, the second because he was destitute of the moral faculty. My father said the case was much more serious, that he had not the instincts of a gentleman. My father thrashed him well and hard. When this was over, Edmund said, "I'm afraid, Daddy, this hurts you much more than it does me." Then my father consulted a doctor who said that a certain insensibility to pain was a frequent accompaniment of the criminal diathesis. He recommended a low diet and bromides. Edmund promptly broke out in spots. Thus he got his way, which was to enter the mercantile marine, as the navy was debarred by circumstance. This was grievous to my father's old-fashioned prejudices, but anything was better than living with an insoluble problem with whom everyone fell in love. The reports received from the training ship went far to reconcile him. These invariably described Edmund as obedient and keen. I am always glad to reflect that my poor father's anxiety and perplexity about this well-beloved child were thus allayed before he very unexpectedly died, and Edmund and I were left alone as regards relatives. Four of our cousins of the senior branch in Ireland we knew hardly anything. They wrote kindly and respectfully about my father, but did not offer to come to the funeral. Shortly after this Edmund went to sea as a gentleman apprentice. He was away some 5 months and returned in irons. I learned that he had broached cargo in order to obtain extra rum for his mess. He explained to me that everybody was in it and the fellow couldn't stand out. I should have been horribly ragged if I had, and it would have been a damned unsporting thing to do. We drew lots for who was to get the stuff, and of course it fell to me. Just a damned family look. I didn't want the beastly stuff myself, for the simple reason that I don't drink rum. Anything else you like, but not rum. It makes your breath smell beastly. I was convinced that his tale was true and felt that on the whole he had behaved well. Of course one could not expect the magistrate to take the same view. This old gentleman enjoyed himself tremendously with such an unusual text to preach about. However, when he had worked off the last of his platitudes, he announced that he had decided to give Edmund the benefit of the First Offenders Act. He said he was influenced largely by the fact of the punishment already undergone by the prisoner through his having come home in irons. I believe the poor old thing imagined that this expression involved actual fetters. As a matter of fact, Edmund's colleagues and the cook had combined to ensure his having a fairly comfortable time. He said himself they didn't even get ratty about my having no work. So Edmund left the court not without a stain on his character, and saddled with certain responsibilities as to reporting to the police, which he described in terms so blasphemous that even to hear him made me feel unfrocked, like Stevenson's maiden lady when she overheard the jongleurs' repartee. Of course, Edmund's indentures were cancelled, and the problem of his future became to me a very anxious one. It did not at all worry Edmund. He regarded the world as his oyster. Shortly before this catastrophe, I had been presented to a small living in Warwickshire by one of our distant and grandiose relatives who had the iniquitous rights of Edwardson. I took Edmund down there in order that we might discuss the situation. My parlour maid at once fell in love with him, and he trot on one of the best pigeons in my modest loft. I pointed out that our joint income, including my stipend, was likely to be less than £400 a year. Edmund said that seemed a good lot for two unmarried blokes. As his own share was less than £50, I thought this was cool. But you can't stop on here indefinitely doing nothing. No, he agreed. Not indefinitely. I think there's just time for a cigarette before dinner. It was impossible to get him to talk seriously about the future. When I tried, I was always whirled away on the wings of his stories of places he had seen and men he had met. He talked so vividly and had so fully the artist trick of setting a character before one in the round and alive in a sentence that I once suggested writing as a possible career. His whole being radiated scorn. "Quill driving be damned," he said. "Even if I knew how to do it, I'm not this sort of man. I'm the sort of man, at least I shall lead the sort of life for other people to write about." I was actually, without consulting him, humbling myself to try a jerk at the strings of the family influence on his behalf when he disappeared. After 3 days he wrote, "Dear old man, I'm back to the sea, so no need to worry. I've just got the chance I wanted, a first-rate sailing ship wanting another deck hand. I made a lucky purchase of a very drunken old sailorman's papers. No questions were asked as they were short of hands, and I soon convinced them I knew my job. Naturally, I have dropped the family name pro tem, and won't be sporting our coat of arms at present. I've sent a line to Scotland Yard to tell them I've got a nice opening in the haberdashery line in the Midlands, and so won't be looking them up for a bit. I will send you a name and address to write to as soon as there is any chance of knowing a port of call in advance. Tell Louisa not to fret too much, and I'll try to bring you home a nice parrot instead of the pigeon I damaged." This time I'm going to be a real good, sensible boy and get on and all the rest of it. Honestly, dry land seems to burn the soles of my feet after a few days. Very many thanks to you for all you've done. This is bound to be a long trip, and though I may not see you again for a year or two, you may be sure of my real honest love. I shall make a beeline for your place whenever I do come home. This parting was a wrench to me, and my home seemed very dull and miserable for a time. I had had my second sentimental tragedy, for I had loved and for a short time had been happy in my love. It had all ended in dissolution and suffering for me, and again Edmund had been my solace. Until he had gone, I did not know how much I was dependent on him. Nevertheless, I had again the feeling that he had behaved well. The incident of the papers purchased from the drunken sailor troubled my conscience a little, but I really scarcely knew what was involved in this, or to what extent it might have been a fair bargain. I trusted Edmund not to have done anything mean, and his sailing under a false name was to mean nothing but the breach of a social convention. I had come to look upon most conventions as things made for the guidance of fools, to be disregarded by sensible men as soon as they became inconvenient. I know it may be argued that this theory of mine is exactly that of the criminal. It is, but the criminal is only a fool with some independence of judgment and exception. The majority of fools walk between the clipped hedges. The wise minority wanders in safety and at large, being careful that the fools do not witness their excursions. We have our own boundaries which we do not transgress. In the meantime, the deaths of two of our Irish cousins from diphtheria had placed me quite near succession to the entailed portion of the family estate, but the present incumbent being a young vigorous man about to marry an heiress, I had never regarded the possibility of my inheriting. It was only a few months after Edmund's departure that this youth went fishing in waders when he should have been in bed, and died very suddenly of appendicitis. I was amazed and rather horrified to find myself an Irish landlord. I resigned my living and went over to Ireland, but neither the place nor the prospect of that life attracted me. I did not understand it and felt a stranger, an usurper. Everything was in the hands of a most capable firm of land agents in Dublin. There was a revenue that to me represented great wealth. The place, though very large, could easily be let for the fishing and shooting. I deliberately ran away and became that accursed thing, an absentee landlord. I salved my conscience by insisting on a policy of foolish generosity to my tenants, and found myself equally abused by the press of all parties in Ireland. After some rather distracted wanderings, I settled down in the Sussex vicarage in which this chapter opens. My researches in Byzantine history, which shared my energies with pigeon flying, had attracted a little attention from some of the learned, and thus I had met the bishop at the Athenaeum. He was patron of my present living, and as no clergyman in his diocese could afford the upkeep of the large and beautiful vicarage, to which a stipend of £200 a year was attached, he gladly offered it to me, and I as gladly accepted it. I had no qualms of conscience, since I was going to give the church more than I received from her in the way of money. I liked the work of a country parson, and believed I could be helpful to a few fellow human beings. As to doctrine, that came within my category of conventions. I had acted in good faith at the time I took my ordination vows, and if I thought I had grown wiser since, there was no need to make a fuss about it. I wanted no one to believe or disbelieve as I did, but I did want to encourage people to behave well. I had many of my father's old-fashioned prejudices, and honestly believed it to be a good thing that the church as well as the army should be officered as far as possible by gentlemen. Thus the years passed very placidly for me. I and my house were in the capable charge of Bates and Mrs. Rattray, my housekeeper and cook, one of the best and wisest women I have ever met. Other servants came and went at her discretion, but my household affairs seemed always to run on ball bearings, and Bates tempered for me the tyranny of the gardener and the coachman. I acquired 4 different reputations. As a breeder of Amaryllis who came home fourth in the Great Cross Channel race already mentioned, my name was familiar in every colliery and public house in the north of England. Among a select circle of the learned, I was known as a conscientious and critical student of an obscure period of history. In my parish, I was generally esteemed as a kindly and generous priest and friend, but by my clerical colleagues I was distrusted. If I was only suspected of heresy, I was positively known to be a trimmer in the vital matter of eastward position. When I officiated in other people's churches, I always adopted the position and methods to which the congregation were accustomed. Thus, both parties united in calling me Mr. Facing Both Ways, and a certain very earnest evangelical once said quite rude things about Laodiceans. This buzzing in my ears was almost my only worry, as Edmund was my only anxiety. His first ship was burned in the Canton River, and he was landed penniless. He got a cable sent to me by the British Consul. Instead of sending what he asked for, I cabled pound 250 and an urgent message to return. I waited in vain for his arrival, eager to share with him all the comfort that had come into my life. Instead, I got a letter in reply to one I had written on chance of his start being delayed. He congratulated me on my good fortune, had gone up country and invested 200 of my good pounds in some wild goose land speculation. All that was wanted to make the money bring forth an hundredfold was another 1,000. It was curious to me that I resented the loss of this pound 250 much more than I should have done when I was a poor man. I knew that this was the effect of possessing money on ordinary men, but I suppose no man expects to find himself reacting after the manner of his kind. I was angry and sent another pound 50 and a peremptory message. Then I was sorry. I could see Edmund cashing the draft and shying from the insult like a young horse from the unexpected. I would have given the 1,000 to have him back, but would not the 1,000 have kept him there until he lost it in its turn? I heard no more, and settled back as comfortably as possible into my groove. But for the first time I felt Edmund had not behaved well. A film formed on the surface of my warm love for him, and I knew there was anger towards myself in his heart. Nearly 2 years passed, during which he wrote 3 times when he wanted money. Paltry sums which I loathed sending, but I could not trust him with a larger amount, though God knows I was willing to share my all with him if he would only spend it and live on it. Then he had come, announced by wire from Southampton. He came in his forecastle kit with 3 sovereigns and some shillings which he called his savings. But he brought the promised parrot in a gilded cage and a costly offering of Chinese silk for Louisa, who had long ago vanished into the limbo which awaits parlour whistles disapproved of by Mrs. Rattray. I admit I was a little nervous about the effect of his arrival and appearance on the arbiters of my household, but in 24 hours they were all his slaves. He talked to Bates as to a fellow-man without any spurious bridging of the fixed gulf, and presented him with a strange exotic pipe. The Chinese silks destined for Louisa he gave to Mrs. Rattray, and I overheard him telling the entranced lady that he had brought them home for her in gratitude for her care of myself, about which he said I wrote so constantly. Thus I was made, as it were, accessory to his falsehoods, and a partaker in the benefit of them. Most amazing of all, I found him plucking fruit I would not have dared to touch, while he told sea tales to the completely subjugated gardener. To me he was delightful as ever. There was all his boyish affection, but that film was there, and I was aware of the spell he exercised as something to be resisted in his own interest. We never spoke of my refusal to send the thousands, but the memory of it was there between us. He was then only 23, but his aspect and manner of a fully equipped man of the world, of vigor and competence to subdue circumstances to his will, made him seem older. It justified a certain humorous treatment of myself as a kind of dear old thing. I had to brace myself to keep my head. It was not until the third evening that I fairly got the talk on to his own affairs and prospects. I unfolded a scheme I had for settling him in the family estate as my representative. I explained my own coward flight and my desire that notwithstanding that the name should not lapse. In any case, I argued, your son, if you ever have one, will inherit. I shall not marry. Everybody thinks that, he objected. We won't discuss it, I said. But in my case there are reasons why you may take it as definite. He looked up and saw at once that this was final. I'm sorry, he said. Very sorry, old man. But even for the sake of a possible Devaran of the next generation, I can't accept your offer. Why? To begin with, it's too generous. It's my desire for my own sake. In any case, I'm not the man for the job. I couldn't do it any more than you could yourself. Fancy me a country gentleman, M.F.H., I suppose, and I can't even ride. I should start comic and become pathetic. I'm only a sort of ticketo leavesman still, and they would want to make me a magistrate. I disagreed with him, but saw that argument was useless and abandoned this favourite project with regret. Have you any plan yourself? I asked. Well, you see, it's the old story. Dry land burns my feet. But you can't go on always before the mast. No, I can take my master's certificate. This sounded pleasantly practical to me, and I was surprised and gratified to learn that he had mastered the theoretical side of navigation and could, as he said, pass the old Board of Trade exams with one hand tied behind him. I encouraged the notion and told him I had no doubt of getting the old trouble with the police cancelled by some of my influential friends on the grounds of lapse of time, youthful indiscretion, and subsequent good behaviour. He laughed at the last clause in a way that made me anxious. Well, he said, they know nothing about me over here. Then you can go to sea in your own name and in a decent capacity. Yes, he drawled satirically, as third officer on a P&O, I suppose, showing ladies round the ship, putting on a boiled shirt and company manners for dinner. No, I'm afraid I should be no better at that than the squire business. But there must be a start of some sort. Not that sort. You people who shop at home see life as if it was half a dozen sets of railway lines, and a man must run on one or the other. It isn't like that at all. If a man just dives in as he would into the sea, he can swim, he can live. There's always something to eat. Making money is only the stake on the game, but the game is played for its own sake. All the duffers are losers, and if you're not a duffer, you win. Then you can come out of it and be as respectable as you like. You will at least have your own memories to live on. It's a bit vague, I said, deliberately unmoved by his eloquence. To be precise, then, my game is going to be trade. When I've got my master's certificate, I mean to be master and part owner of a little trading brigantine out east. I've studied the thing and I know the business. It's the life I like and understand, and there's pots of money in it when you know the ropes and the right people. I'm not talking any storybook rot. There are commodities out there that you can trade best in small boats, little cargoes of high value, things people know nothing about at home. It all means capital, doesn't it? Oh, of course, one must have some capital, very little to start. To people in the know, it's a first-rate investment. I said no more, and Edmund knew I meant to refuse to find the money for him. I can understand better now how exasperating I must have seemed. A country parson wrapping himself in a cloak of ignorance and taking it for superior wisdom. However, he kept his temper perfectly, but this little root of bitterness between us grew and swelled. He stopped with me during the weeks it took to obtain his certificate and satisfy the legal authorities of his having purged his early offence. Then he signed on as second officer on board an east-bound tramp. Beyond his necessary expenses and £50, for which he insisted on giving me an IOU, he would take nothing from me. I know nothing of his odyssey during the next 2 years, except that he told me that through friends in Hong Kong he had secured a small interest in a trading venture and had both made and lost money. But he came home as poor as he went, though fuller than ever of confidence, as gay-hearted at 25 as he had been at 18, and delightful as ever to look upon. I had good news for him. During his absence there had been an opportunity of realizing the remnant of my mother's estate, and acting under a power of attorney I had from him, I had sold out on his behalf as well as my own. There was thus a sum of nearly £2,000 awaiting Edmund. Had I known why the property came to have a value at all, and held on until the rubber boom developed, it would have been nearer £10,000. As it was, others made this money. But to do Edmund justice, he never reproached me with this. He went back to the East with his fortune, his high spirits, and his confidence. He wrote twice as long intervals, each time wanting money. He explained that this was for necessary current expenses, not for speculation, that his capital was practically intact, but locked up in trade. Freights and markets had gone against him every time, but it was only a matter of holding on. He was bound to win out all right. I seemed to see a wistful eye and a trembling lip in the letters, and I hated the thought of Edmund beaten. I think I wanted him to prove me wrong to myself. And yet the sending of the money was oddly annoying, though I neither missed it nor grudged it. It somehow thickened that film on our affections. Thus, as I have said, for over a year I had heard nothing until this telegram arrived. I trust I have explained my reluctance to order the champagne and my final capitulation to Bates' reproachful eye. End of chapter 1.